They were decent people. But the problem is, how are you going to talk to decent people? We don't speak the language. We finally found one fellow in the town with whom we can communicate. His name was Abdul. He was half Tatar and half Turk. And he had been born in Siberia and had served in the Tsar's army, so he had learned Russian. So we had a language of communication. Not only that, but Abdul was married to the daughter of Timur, who was the head man of the town. Now, Timur had some interesting ideas. This was a big town, but he would like something with prestige, plus the fact that the Mongols are Buddhist. You may not know that, but the Mongols are Buddhist. And so he wanted to build a great lamastery. This would be a central place in that part of Mongolia. There was a problem. They had never constructed that kind of building. You see, the Mongols each lived in a hut which consisted of felt stretched across wood bent into a hemisphere shape. So they had never actually constructed anything like a two-story building. But my father and my brother and I, we'd all worked on two-story buildings. So a deal was made. They would supply the materials, and we would build the lamastery. And during that period, they would supply us with food, with clothing, with shelter. So we had a place to stay, and food to eat, and water to drink. And it took us 2 years to build that lamastery. And during that time, we learned significantly about the Mongol people. In fact, we 4 kids, the survivors, we learned to pick up the Mongol language. My parents were a little slower at that. But we were able to get along with the Mongol language. In any case, after 2 years, they had promised at the end they would take us to the capital, Urga. And from Urga, there's a road going south into China. So this is now 1917. And a little change had taken place in the world during those 2 years. You see, there'd been a revolution in Russia. And so now you had a Bolshevik Red Army, which had captured the area of they captured the area of Siberia north of Mongolia. So the White Army, loyal to the Tsar, had fled to Urga, the capital of Mongolia, and they were using this as a base to make forays against the Red Army to the north. So who should arrive in town? A caravan containing 6 Jews. Not a weapon, not a knife, not a nothing between us. The Russians demand that they turn us, those Jewish-looking people, over to them. To his credit, the head of the convoy, the head of our caravan, faced them off. Every Mongol had his rifle ready. So the Russians knew they weren't going to get us without getting killed. But he explained to me, look, we can't take you all the way down to China. So if you go down the road, the Russians can follow you, and you'll be dead. Take my advice. Go across the Gobi Desert down to China. They're not going to follow you across the Gobi. Well, they knew this is a long trip. So what they did is they packed up as much food and as many leather containers of water as we could carry, and they gave it to us to start our trip across the Gobi Desert. And so we started in the general direction in which the caravan head had pointed to. By the end of 4 weeks, we had eaten and drank everything that they gave us. From here on in, we're in the Gobi Desert, which isn't called desert because it's a Garden of Eden. So if you could find occasionally some dried grass or some roots, that's what you ate. If you were fortunate to have a little snowfall, which was infrequent in that area, otherwise it wouldn't be a desert, so you filled up your little leather flask with your leather pouch with water, with ice, melted into water so you had something to drink. But nevertheless, we were moving more and more slowly as we grew weaker and weaker. And one day, who should be galloping up towards us? A Mongol band. And they looked at us, and one of them galloped up and touched my father to see if he was real or a mirage. They'd never seen 6 crazy Caucasians trying to cross the Gobi Desert, which I later learned is 1,000 miles from north to south and 3,000 miles from east to west. In any case, in an act of marvelous sympathy, each of them galloped up to us and handed us their flatbreads, their cheeses, and filled up our containers with water. And then they galloped off, never to be seen again. So we continued on our trip, and we somehow crossed the Gobi Desert at a price. Our youngest sister perished, and we had no stone, no wood to mark her grave, even if we could ever find our way back there to the Gobi Desert. So now there were three of us children and our two parents. And we arrived in a city called Turkoman, which was in Inner Mongolia, which was part of China. And we had learned the Mongol language, so we had some way of communication, and this is Inner Mongolia. And we met a gentleman who was a Mongol gentleman married to a Han Chinese woman. Han is ethnic Chinese. And he's a merchant, and he's got a job for us. He's got a warehouse that has to be expanded. We make a deal. We will expand this warehouse. In return, we get food, water, and shelter. And so we stayed with them for a period of time to expand the warehouse. In the process, especially we kids, we learned Chinese, particularly from the wife. She's a Han Chinese woman. The Mongol, he spoke some Chinese too, otherwise he couldn't get along as a merchant in town, but the wife was even better. So we'd learned some of the Chinese language before we joined the next caravan, going into China proper. And now we reach a big city, and we met a nice gentleman by the name of Old Wang. Old Wang is not that old, he was in his 60s. He's got a need. He's marrying his sixth wife. Now technically it's really 5 concubines and a wife, but you see, Old Wang has a system. Each wife is a separate house. He decides which house he will sleep within, and of course which wife he will sleep with that
On
night.
a particular night.
And each one's children stay with her. His new wife is 16. You see, he had been gambling with her father and he won a series of bets. And to pay off the debts, the father gave him his daughter. Not very nice, because the girl was hoping to marry some young man a little closer to her age than Old Wang.
Such a deal.
But that's the way it goes, at least in that town. And so we're building a 6th house for the 6th wife of Old Wang. Actually 7 houses, because he had a main house for himself. During the day he stand there, and then nights he had a bed spring in each of 6 places. In this city, unfortunately, another disaster occurred. A sort of plague swept through the city. Thousands died. It was later known as the swine flu epidemic. And among the thousands that died were my stepmother and my last remaining sister. So now we're down to 3, my father, my brother Joseph, and myself. After we completed the work, so we're going in the next caravan, we're going to Xi'an. I guess in the Western world it's spelled X-I-A-N. It apparently had been the first capital of China when the country was united, more than 2,000 years ago. And in Xi'an, we met up with another fine gentleman, this time a Caucasian, a European. He was a missionary, a Catholic missionary, and he had a mission in Xi'an. Listen, he needed the roof repaired. You got a deal. You got a couple of skilled craftsmen. We're going to fix your roof. And in exchange, we got food and shelter at the mission. We also got something else accomplished while we were there. You see, the missionary knew people in Vienna, and he communicated with them. Guess we were there for an extended period of time, and we learned that Uncle Judah and his family were settled in Vienna. They had never gone back to Rosvedov. So we now had a line of communication by a mail that might take 6 weeks with Uncle Judah, some relatives. In any case, when we completed our job, we joined the next caravan. And we're headed now, as we now knew, south and east. And we end up in the city of Kaifeng. Kaifeng was a very interesting city, as we learned. By Western standards, it had a huge population. By Chinese standards, a middle-sized city.